Good evening. I'm Jeannie Long, Executive Director, Chicago Collections Consortium. Please note tonight's program will be recorded and posted on CCC's website and YouTube channel. CCC is honored to launch the book Chicago Modern Mayors from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. And for a conversation tonight with Betty O'Shaughnessy, Dick Simpson, Clinton Stockwell, and Dominic Pasiga, who will be moderating the discussion. We're proud to host this program in partnership with the University of Illinois Chicago Library, a founding member of Chicago Collections Consortium. But before we begin, if you're joining us for the first time tonight, Chicago Collections is a consortium of museums, libraries, and organizations all working together for the preservation and promotion of Chicago history and culture. We do this through the sharing of archival collections on Explore Chicago Collections portal freely and openly. We invite you to jump on the website and check us out. We'd like to begin our program tonight with Chicago Collections Land Acknowledgement Statement, which reads, Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. I'd like to thank CCC donors shown here for this generous support, which allows us to offer unique free programming in addition to supporting the Explore Chicago Collections portal. I know our time tonight is going to go by quickly, but we want to be sure to remind you to check out CCC's website for a listing of other upcoming events. Again, I'm excited to welcome Betty, Dominic, Dick, and Clinton to the conversation tonight. And thank you, Dominic, for leading the discussion. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And welcome. I know tonight is another political night in New Hampshire, whether it's boring or not. We'll see what happens. Anyway, let's discuss this book. First of all, my first question would be, how would you describe the book? What is it about? What did you find? And maybe Betty can begin this since she wrote this wonderful introduction.
Oh, thank you. Well, the goal of the book is to trace Chicago politics and the government from the end of the 20th century to the beginning of the 21st century with key themes. And what we do is we do it through the mayors. We look at all these mayors, starting with Harold Washington. What we see is we see Chicago changing. There's a shift in the economy from a manufacturing city to a service kind of economy. There's a population decline. The gap between the rich and poor is getting huge, and we have a shrinking middle class. And there's a struggle between machine politicians and progressive reform politicians whenever there's a time of crisis. And this is a time that's going on now. Now, what we really do is to get an idea of how the mayors approach this, because each mayor was different, and each one approached it slightly differently. But there's basically two kinds of mayors that we decided to have. And one of them was an establishment kind of mayor, and one was a progressive reform type of mayor. It becomes obvious as you read the book that the modern mayors have qualities of both, but basically they're one or the other. And so establishment mayors, in olden days, when I was a little kid, you had machine politicians. You had Anton Cermak, you had Ed Kelly, you had Richard J. Daley, of course. And these people were known to have patronage, crooked contracts, rigged elections. Today, the establishment mayor, if we have one, right now we don't, they still get support from business, but they get also support from national party leaders, major institutions, and they see themselves as CEOs more than anything else. They're entrepreneurial mayors. They attract tourists. They attract big corporations. That's what they want. What's good for Chicago is good for business. They set the city agenda. Now, progressive reform mayors are a little different. In the old days, you have William Deaver and Edward Dunn, and they were civil reformers. These guys are civil reformers, but they are also people that want to work for the communities. They want good government. They also want to end injustice. They get their support from small businesses, minorities, the new kind of minorities, Hispanics, LGBT, people like that, Dominicans, something like that. They get wealthy donors like the establishment guys, but theirs are from Hollywood. They get George Clooney, people like that. The establishment mayors that we write about in the book are Richard M. Daley, Rahm Emanuel, and the progressive reform are Harold Washington, Lori Lightfoot, and Sawyer is sort of in between, but really more a progressive reform guy.
Probably important to also suggest that the arc of the book goes from Harold Washington and his reform progressive agenda to Lori Lightfoot, and the book ends on the progressive reform mayor again. And Brandon Johnson continues much in the same direction that Lori Lightfoot did.
Yes, that's what we have. And so that's basically what we wrote about. Now, when we wrote about this, we asked the authors to answer 3 questions for us. And the first question is, how did this person become mayor? What were the conditions at the time? How were these people persuaded to run? Some of them weren't thinking about it. Who were their supporters? Who were their detractors? What were their election strategies? Where'd they get their money from? That's the first question we asked. The second question we asked is, what were their relationships with the city council? How did they work with aldermen? Were they, did they have a rubber stamp city council to do anything they asked? Were they independent guys that would do whatever they felt? Was it a divided city council? Was it council wars? There's different ways the city council worked with each mayor. We look at that. And then the last thing, which is probably the most important because it puts the first 2 things together, what was their legacy? What were their successes? What were their failures? What were the conflicts they found? Who were the rivals they had? And then we try to evaluate their legacy. And so we see the mayors in the 21st century, they follow both the establishment or builder mayors, some people call them, and the progressive reform path. Now,
Betty Dominic has some other questions for us. So
okay, I'm sorry.
Okay. If I could just add a little bit here. Sure. I'm the bibliographer, so I did not write a chapter, but it was a pleasure to reading the book and to reflecting on this legacy of mayoral leadership in Chicago. And it seems to me that with the first chapter that is on Harold Washington after Betty's excellent introductory chapter, begins with looking at the kingpin, Richard J. Daley. And I was thinking Richard J., Richard M., and Rahm Emanuel in particular, what were they about? And there was a book on Richard J. Daley called American Pharaoh. He was the great builder. And my goodness, so was Richard M. Daley, sort of reconstructing the entire lakefront. And Rahm Emanuel, his, I think probably it's not 606 to Bloomingdale Trail, but the Riverwalk, I think, is going to be perhaps the highlight of his legacy. So you have these great building projects that Richard J., Richard M., and Rahm Emanuel did. And it's kind of a trickle down view. If we can get money downtown, it will eventually trickle down to the neighborhoods. But Harold would say, you know, I don't care who you are, you can't escape from my fairness. And I'm going to see that economic development dollars don't just get stuck downtown, but they're going to go to the neighborhoods for reasons of equity and social justice. And I see a Lightfoot and hopefully Brandon Johnson as being in that trajectory.
Great. So, well, all right. So thank you. Let's begin, since this is sponsored by the Chicago Collections Consortium. What archival, and this might be aimed basically at Clinton, what archival resources, collections did the authors use when writing their entries for the book? What archives are the best for those interested in pursuing further research on the city's mayors?
Well, I think I'm probably not the best person to answer that since I didn't write the essay, but I do have graduate work in history, the history of Chicago. You certainly can't go wrong with the Chicago Historical Society. At the public library, Dominic, you know Professor Perry Dewis,
Sure.
Who was at UIC. He would never graduate you if you didn't go through those newspapers,
Right.
both old and new. And I think today, that's what I would look at is what do these old newspapers and also things like Crane's Chicago Business, what do they tell us about the mayors and their work? But I have to also say that if possible, I believe in the personal touch. I did a little master's thesis on immigration policy in Chicago, and it was current. And I interviewed 30 organizations that dealt with immigration policy. And as much as possible, if you can find people that were working in these administrations to get interviews from them on the personal side, I think that adds a lot to one's discussion.
In each of the chapters, as Betty suggested, we cover different topics. And so one of the things we cover are the elections, how the mayors got to be elected. And for that, the Board of Election statistics are important. Whether they're collected at the time or you look back at them, there are also a number of books that are in Clinton's bibliography that talk about elections specifically of each of the mayors. The second thing we look at is the relation of the mayor of Chicago City Council. And we look at the city council, we look at the divided roll call votes. And, those are harder to come by than you might think. The journal of the city council for each year is 2,000 pages long. For when we study a year of the city council, when we had only the journals to work with, it took 100 person hours for each year to be able to straighten out which way the aldermen voted on the important decisions. And we've looked at particularly the divided roll call votes because those are the ones that the fights were about. And those were the political struggles of each era. We have also at the University of Illinois at Chicago in my papers and at our website, if you just Google Chicago politics at UIC, we have 14 papers written on the city council that already collect roll call votes for different years. And I want to put a particular plug in for the libraries. The city clerk's office is attempting to digitalize the votes of the city council. That would be an enormous step forward. We're in danger of having to use 100 person hours each year if we want to know what's going on. So once we know what the divided roll call votes are, then Clinton is right that what we do is go to the newspapers to get the quotes about what did everyone say about them. And that gave us the information related to the, what did Mayor Richard M. Daley say? What did someone on the other side say about each fight, say the budget fights, which are usually among the most fierce in the city council. After we do that, we look at the legacy. We have to go to the books like the ones that are in the bibliography, but also we can go to the papers. The papers are primary of these mayors. The long-term papers from earlier eras are at the Chicago History Museum. But at this, with these mayors, they're either at the UIC special collections or they're at the public libraries, the Woodson Library and the Harold Washington Library.
Yeah, I'm especially impressed by the collections at UIC, which has a tremendous amount of aldermanic collections, but also the papers of Richard J. Daley, who people who said he never wrote anything down. Well, he a whole bunch of stuff to the archives, and I've made my way through them, as well as the Richard M. Daley collection. So It's there's a treasure trove of information out there if you're willing to dig around. I'm one of the things that impressed me by your book is that the legacy of Harold Washington. The book implies that the impact of Harold Washington's legacy has been long lasting. How did this legacy impact the mayors that followed him?
Well, first of all, Harold had two parts to his program, which were also the same as for Lori Lightfoot. And one side was good government reform, and the other side was progressive politics, progressive reform. On the good government side, the first thing Harold did when he was in office, and I helped put it together for him, was the executive order which made freedom of information possible for city documents. When I was alderman, you had to take a pen and a pad and go to the comptroller's office, and even as alderman, copy the data. It was not available in any form. You couldn't ask for freedom of information. It was all secret information, even though the public paid for it. So that was a huge step forward. The end of Harold Washington's term, he passed the ethics ordinance. David Orr introduced it for him, and it was the first ethics ordinance in Chicago history. Besides that, on the progressive side of the agenda, before Harold Washington, there was no affirmative action in city government. After Harold Washington, there was affirmative action in appointment of the cabinet, in jobs at City Hall, and in contracts. That was a huge breakthrough moment for Chicago history because he signed the Shachtman Decree. What signing the Shachtman Decree did was reduce the number of patronage workers. His most important economic program was what was called balanced economic development. As Betty mentioned earlier, it was not just to build up the loop, it was to equally build up the neighborhoods, like the manufacturing zones in each of the neighborhoods. So those were really important dimensions that firmly affected everything after. So before Harold Washington, there were 35,000 patronage workers. By the time of Richard M. Daley, there were only 5,000. Made a huge difference to the machine. By the way, that's another source are the lawsuits, which have valuable information like the Shachtman Decree and the Sorge decision.
One of the things that I think you have to add too was that after Harold, the public saw the mayor's office differently and the city council differently. For instance, Richard M. Daley always made sure whenever he gave his little press conferences, and he would give them, unlike his dad. His dad was always just trying to get away from that, but he would go in and talk. But one of the things he always would do is make sure you knew that this was going to be good for the community. And all the mayors after Harold Washington made sure, whether it was true or not, that the public knew that they were looking for the neighborhoods as well as everybody else.
I think that Harold Washington set a standard that we're still trying to look up to. The affirmative action policies and inclusion. More African Americans were in government as a result of his work, as well as Latin Americans as well. The West Side and the South Side, he was able to pull that together, those two African American communities, in a way that that no one else since has yet been able to do. He was able to unify the Black nationalists who would say, it's our turn now. We really have to look at our needs, with the white liberals on the North Side. And he was able to build this great coalition, and also with the Latin American community. Washington was also inclusive of community-based organizations. They were his friends. He didn't mind it if they took over some of his policy goals. And so he was a great example of inclusiveness. And I think even Richard M. Daley, who we put in another camp, I think there are some patterns of inclusion even in Richard M. Daley's administration, as well as continuing PMDs, planned manufacturing districts, some of the policies of Washington that he also tried to continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you see these planned industrial areas, probably the most successful one is the Union Stockyard one, which today employs about 15,000 people. And it's the one place that TIF monies have been used quite well, rather than in some of the other places which we've had problems with. But now, when we talk about Harold, let me go back a little bit to somebody who you don't have a chapter on. Why does Jane Byrne lose? What happened with Jane Byrne?
So there's a pretty good reason why Jane Byrne lost. I'm sure Dominic and the others remember that Jane Byrne came in as a reformer. She was going to get rid of the evil cabal until she joined it right after she became mayor. Yeah. She joined up with Eddie Berdoliak and Ed Burke to run the city council for her and to run the political party for her. And so that convinced all the reformers, the progressive part of reform and the good government reformers, they couldn't support Jane Byrne, even though they had in her first election. And then secondly, for reasons that are still a little confusing to me, she decided to appoint only conservative whites instead of blacks to like the Chicago School Board and the CHA. So if you alienate the two parts of your coalition that you got elected by, it's not a good move. Finally, she split the Democratic Party. So there was the Richard M. Daley wing and the Jane Byrne wing. And when you have two whites dividing a political party and Harold Washington as the only African-American, that seems to me to be the recipe to lose the next election.
You know, the relationship, Dick, between Jane Byrne and the Daley family was very stressful in many ways. Even though she had worked with the original Richard J. Daley, right? But Sis Daley really despised her, and then the son Richard M. Daley broke with her very early, and well, she broke with him as well. So I mean, it does seem
she
like
was always threatened. She always thought Richard M. Daley would be the one who would come back and regain the throne, which he did a little while later. But she was threatened at the beginning. She fired all of the Richard M. Daley supporters in city government. Which, again, was what caused that split. Not only the personal split between the Daleys and Jane Byrne, but the political split.
Sure. And, what's interesting is now, let's get to Richard M. Daley. I've often said that this was not his father's machine. This was a different kind of organization. Maybe we can go a little bit into that. How did it change? And was it just because of Shachtman, or were there other influences on it?
Well, I can cover that a little and then let the other two. Did you want to go ahead, Betty? Go ahead.
Well, the only thing I was thinking was that you go ahead. I just lost my train of thought. Okay.
So there are several factors. First of all, I already mentioned that the number of patronage workers had dropped from 35,000 to 5,000 based on the court decisions and the information we got from them. So the patronage army was partly disappearing, but it didn't disappear altogether. What Daley was also had, after his father died, the ward committeemen and the political bosses tried to get rid of it. So he wasn't fond of the ward organization. Some of them supported him, and he did work with those, but he built his own patronage army. Those 5,000 patronage workers did not go to the Mike Madigan ward or the 41st ward or some other ward. They were Daley's own, they called themselves the Daley Volunteers. I worked with them on Carol Moseley Braun's election, which was a strange experience altogether. But these Daley Volunteers were the downtown employees who came out and went to whichever ward or congressional district Daley told them to go to, and worked for Attila the Hun or whoever else was running that particular election. So that's a pretty big kind of event, though. But why did he win? So if he lost all this ward organization support, how could he win the election? And the answer was he completely changed the election playbook. His father had never raised $1 million in any of his campaigns for mayor. But Richard M. Daley raised $7 million. And with $7 million, what he did was hire, he no longer had his brother running the campaign as he had when he ran against Harold. He had David Axelrod, Rahm Emanuel, and other political consultants. And they bought, for the first time from the Daley family, TV ads. And they did direct mail pieces. They ran the campaign in a presidential style. So we had a presidential campaign for mayor, and all of the campaigns that follow at least have part of that playbook.
You know,
He also wanted to make himself look inclusive. And so you see him marching in the Gay Pride Parade. Can you imagine Richard J. Daley marching in the Gay Pride Parade? That just wouldn't have happened. But he did that, and he also made sure he appointed women. He appointed African Americans. He was diverse in some of the things he was doing. But he also knew how to get money into his coffers, but also for the city. So he did what Rahm Emanuel did later. He got rich guys to invest in the city.
Well, there's this whole idea about neoliberalism too. So he sells off the Skyway. He sells off the parking meters. This is later in his.
That was later, yeah.
But it's the one thing he's now remembered for more than anything else. In many ways, and despite
the chapter on Daley, written by our colleagues, which is who had written the book earlier, City of Spectacle.
Yeah.
Made a particular comment that the most surprising thing of all of Richard M. Daley is how quickly he disappeared from the public scene and how little regard that last year, with the continued corruption, with the beginning to come out of the police abuse cases like the John Burge cases, the selling of the parking meters, the selling of the Skyway, all of those things became part of a legacy. The failure to get the Olympics was a major blow. And so that all added up at the end of the Daley administration. But it is still surprising. Once you're out of public office, there's a natural deflation. Mm-hmm. But his has been more than any other mayor's.
You know, it's interesting in the Olympics question, since he was out corrupted by Brazil.
Right. That's always been so interesting. Rio de Janeiro's bought more of the people than famous Chicago, the most corrupt city in the United States, did. And so we failed to corrupt the Olympic Committee like the South American countries did.
Well, you know, another thing that has changed tremendously is the sort of disappearance of precinct captains, the loss of the 311. You can call in and report potholes directly, right? And they may not get fixed as fast as they used to, but you can report them directly. But that's taken a lot of power away from local aldermen. And I wonder how much that has had an impact. There's been a decline, I think, and it isn't just because of Burke and the indictment. It's been an ongoing kind of thing that aldermen are losing their power. I think in wards. I grew up in the 14th ward, Burke's ward. I lived for quite a while in the 13th ward, Mike Madigan's ward. Obviously, I'm a South Sider. And now I live in the 19th ward, which is supposed to be also sort of a machine ward. But I haven't seen a precinct captain in 25 years. They have disappeared. They're like dinosaurs. They're gone. And I wonder how much that had an impact on the old machine, because the machine is really different. I think using the term machine may be difficult to do today. It's different.
What we term it as, Dominic, is the new Chicago machine, okay. Which is so. As Betty pointed out, you start with money contributions from the global economy, the lawyers, the businesses in the global economy, the stock market brokers, and so on. And then you substitute for the ward organizations and the precinct captains you're talking about. this roving daily organization people, the patronage workers that the mayor still is able to keep hold of. And then on the other side, you do have still the corruption of the machine. You were mentioning aldermen. 37 aldermen have gone to jail since 1972. 2,124 public officials in the state of Illinois have gone to federal prison. 1,800 of those come from the Chicago region. Many of the aspects are still there, but they take a different form, and they took an even it's more complicated form under Rahm Emanuel, which I can't easily describe just in words quickly, but there is still a machine. It's just that the machine now keeps losing. They lost to Lori Lightfoot, they lost to Brandon Johnson. So things are quite different.
But that brings up another question, Dick. One of the questions now is that a lot of people are pointing to the new machine as the Chicago Teachers Union and the SEIU and all these labor unions who are flooding wards with workers who are doing what patronage workers used to do. And I wonder, is this a new machine? Is this a new organization? And how does that fit into the profile that of the mayors that you've written so far? I mean, Brandon Johnson seems to be a different horse in the race, and we'll see how that works out over the next few years. But it's too early to say anything right now. But he has this progressive push, but he's having a hard time delivering on many of these things. And as Lori Lightfoot did too.
Well, in Brandon's case, is a very simple answer. He said we needed $800 million to carry out his progressive program. He doesn't have $800 million extra dollars, and he can't raise the property taxes to get there. However, if he does pass the Bring Chicago Home ordinance, the transaction tax, the transfer real estate transfer tax, will bring in $100 million a year that's dedicated to dealing with homelessness. And that's a very progressive program to deal with those who are worse off in your city. But he still has to pass it March 19th.
Yeah. Well, which brings me to Lori Lightfoot. What do you attribute her defeat to?
Clinton, you want to take that?
But one thing the chapter seems to talk about is that Lightfoot had strained relations with the teachers and with the police. And also the chapter seemed to say that with the progressive groups, they would want something and she would question aspects of it, which may have been very frustrating to those groups that were progressive. But I was really fascinated in the chapter on Lightfoot with a number of factions and voting blocks. And that's a very different animal than Harold Washington had to deal with. But just had the 29 and his own group. And Daley and Rahm seemed to have more control, but Lightfoot had a very difficult time, I think, with dealing with the very different factions that were trying to get their agenda to the fore. And I'm wondering if that is also was a problem for her.
So there were 4 factions in the city council. There was the progressive faction, Progressive Caucus, as it was called, which we still have in the new council. There was the center liberal faction, which was mostly the lakefront aldermen and the ones who were committee chairmen. Then there were 2 opposition factions. They were the conservatives on the northwest side, who were really Republicans. And then there was the machine faction, the Eddie Burke. There were about 5 in that category. And so Clinton's quite right. There were these dueling factions. Lori actually ended up winning all the votes in the city council. She didn't lose, but the city council became much more active, much more independent. And that's true today, even though the factions have changed. It's a new concept in Chicago. Maybe the city council should be a legislative body.
Well, there's an idea, huh? Good luck with that. We'll see how that goes. So let me ask, as time is winding down, how do you all see the progressive agenda developing over the last few years? First of all, from from Washington through Lightfoot to perhaps the future?
I think Dick used the term progressive or incrementalism, that when you think of Harold Washington, he started it. He was going to be a progressive, and he put progressive things into his administration. So you have him cleaning up the law department, stuff like that. Every time you have a new mayor, no matter whether they're a progressive reformer or if they're a builder, they become a little more progressive than the guys right before them. And so that's what we see. And sometimes they do it for different reasons. Like Rahm Emanuel just wanted to have a whole lot of rich guys running downtown and getting money for him, but he didn't bring it into the neighborhoods. Lori Lightfoot wanted to bring it into the neighborhoods, but she wanted to have the political part of it kind of done her way, which might be why she lost, because she came off, I got teased a lot for using this term, as crabby, just as did Jane Byrne for that matter. Right. And she abandoned the progressives much worse than did Lori Lightfoot.
But that brings a question. Defining her as crabby and as Calamity Jane was called, etc. Is this not a misogynist way of looking at women in politics?
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be.
A man gets crabby, Richard M., Richard J., Rahm, he's showing strength, right? If a woman gets crabby, she's a
crab.
Yeah.
And we can't forget the elephant that's in the 200 and some odd square miles of Chicago, and that's crime. And I think that was the looting downtown under Lightfoot's leadership was a real shock and an embarrassment for us. And that partially explains the relative success of Paul Vallis. Do we need a law and order person with a lot of police on the streets? And the city voted for Brandon Johnson. And I think back to your original question, Dominic, I think whether or not there's a progressive time ahead of us, it depends right now on the extent that Brandon Johnson can show his leadership and unify the city, so we can find ways to both extend racial justice and also to protect its citizens.
Yeah, one of the things we do in each of the chapters is talk about the biggest challenge to the mayor. And I'll just take the ones to Lori, for instance. COVID-19 was really a major phenomenon. The Lori Lightfoot administration, with her health commissioner, saved maybe hundreds of thousands of lives, certainly tens of thousands of lives with the COVID policies, which were unpopular frequently, but they were the right policies that kept many people alive and many people not suffering from COVID. When she got to the police issue, though, and the crime issue, the crime did go up. It didn't go up, interestingly enough, as high as under the Richard M. Daley administration, when there were more than 800 murders a year, but it went up from over the Rahm Emanuel administration. And therefore, the crime was really a major force. You ask if progressivism will continue. Well, this is an arc back and forth. Remember, we started with progressive Harold Washington. Sawyer carried out much of his agenda. And then we went to Daley and Emanuel, who made us a global city and made us a city of spectacle. And then we're back to Lori Lightfoot and Lori Lightfoot's most important policy, which was Invest Southwest.
Right.
And Brandon Johnson is going in the same direction, even though he, running against Lori Lightfoot, he, pretended that she didn't do any good, but it's basically, he's sort of Lori Lightfoot on steroids. He's doing more progressive, more expensive progressive steps. Whether you'll, as you say, whether you'll make it or not, that's another problem, but it's much better than, going back to the Richard J. Daley machine era, which I remember personally very, very well, because I was fighting Daley on the floor of the city council.
So, we've got about a few more minutes before we open up the questions from the audience. What's your next project? It's kind of early maybe to ask you that. You just had a book come out, but all three of you, what are you up to? Betty?
I am working with Dick on a new book, and I'm writing one chapter of it. He's writing the rest, but I'm writing the chapter on transportation and how the dreamers of Chicago put together plans for how to make this place this absolutely phenomenal transportation hub. And it started with Joliet. You know, he saw, oh, look what you can do with this. And it still goes on with O'Hare and with the Kingery Expressway, and in the west of the city. We have the elevated. We have an elevated that still works, and its rivets are still there, unlike the Titanic's, which was put in the same decade. And these are the kinds of things that I'm writing on. And Dick will tell you about the rest of the book.
So the book is called Dreaming Chicago's Future. It's by University of Illinois Press. Probably be 2 years before it comes out. But Betty and I finished the manuscript, which is the first, and we've got the contract, so it is going to exist. I'll just give a shout out. One of the sources that's been very helpful has been the Encyclopedia of Chicago, because it has the short chapter, little short encyclopedia-like entrees of nearly everything and every person who was of any significance in Chicago, not all of them, but thousands. And it's a very useful beginning point, and it's now available online. The other is the Newberry has published for teachers guides, so that if you're looking, for instance, what was the effect of the 1933 World's Fair, which is not a very well known anymore. The 1896 is better known. But the Newberry has some very good guides that they have put together, particularly for teachers, high school, college teachers. And if you're writing a book, all you have to do is look at the Encyclopedia of Chicago, look at the Newberry material and similar ones that others have put up. And it's fascinating how much history is tucked away and available, particularly through the ability to access it on the internet, including Chicago collections.
Yeah, Chicago Collections is great. You can look up all kinds of things and find the archives that you can go to if you need to. Yeah.
By the way, one story, Dominic, which was one of the reasons I was involved in creating Chicago Collections. When I did the book Rogues, Rebels, and Rubber Stamps, I needed to get the information about the city council voting from 1893 to the present. And so I would try and figure out, well, what library has it? So I went to the famous ones like the Chicago Historical Society. And yes, they have wonderful papers like the Dupre papers, but they are missing the 1955 City Council Journal, which is when Daley became mayor. So there are gaps even in the Chicago Historical Museum, as great as they are. I ended up going to the State Depository, which is at the basement of Northeastern University, that I don't think many people have visited because they have the 1830s material that no one else had. We've now copied it at UIC, but basically it's still a secret. I ended up going to the UIC papers. I ended up going to the Historical Society and to the Harold Washington Library. But I didn't know which library had which thing. You know, I had to hunt around. I went physically to the library and looked and see what their finder's guide is. This is much easier for scholars today than it was then.
Oh yeah, I mean, I wish I was writing my dissertation today. I
Me
could
too.
do it from my bedroom to a large extent. How about you, Clinton? What are you up to?
Yes, I'm in a little bit different space. I'm teaching some sections of a course called Reading Chicago through the Graham School of the University of Chicago. Last year, one of the books we read was by Dominic Pasigas on the slaughterhouse. And this was a great book if you want to know about U.S. capitalism. It's kind of birthed in Chicago. In the spring, I'm doing a course on the culture of Chicago. And one of those books is by Blair Kamen. Who is a city for? So an architecture. Then there's a book also on the Jazz Age in Chicago we'll be using. In the fall, I'm happy to say that we would be teaching a course through the Graham School on Chicago politics. And we'll be using this particular book on the Chicago mayors and a few other books by Dick Simpson, including another book that we should read that's very important for our time on democracy's rebirth.
Well, I think all of us would like to thank you for that paid political announcement. Thank you so much. So maybe we can turn it over now to questions from the audience.
And please post your questions to our Q&A. And really, thank you all for this enlightening conversation. And Dominic, I want to hear from you. What are you working on?
Well, I'm working on a manuscript that's looking at the rise and fall of the democratic machine from 1870 till yesterday, and it's something now I wish I had not even started because it's been a burden. But well, I shouldn't say a burden. It's been it's a love-hate relationship at this point. It's about 500 pages, and I'm just going through the peer review comments and responding to them and changing the manuscript quite a bit.
Well, let us know how Chicago Collections can help in any way. And listening to Dick talk about some of our member collections at Northeastern Illinois, now we've grown to over 60 member organizations, which include the Office of the City Clerk of Chicago. So we're thrilled with kind of the diversity of these archival collections as well. So no, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to launch this. And for those that are interested in purchasing the book from the University of Illinois Chicago Press, you would see on our website the link to purchasing the book as well. Any questions from any of our panelists for each other, or?
Well, I think one of the questions is the one Dominic asked is, where do we go from here? Talked about the challenge and the Lori Lightfoot period. Today's challenge is obviously the asylum seekers and the coming of the 2024 Democratic National Convention, which, you know, back in 1968, we had the clash of the 60s, two different political cultures, and meaning it really broadly, not voting cultures only, that clashed in the parks and in the convention hall. In 1996, we had a calm convention with no problems, and it showed that Chicago could hold them. But 2024, the people who are going to come to demonstrate on one side or the other for abortion, the problems with Texas sending hundreds of buses full of asylum seekers. We've already had 35,000 asylum seekers come to Chicago in the last few months. So I think the progressive direction of the city will continue. I think Chicago will continue to develop, and that we can all be proud of where it's going to go, but it's not going to be without a fight. It's never finished. It's always a work in progress and a political fight as to where we will go next.
Yeah, and you know, Dick, the actually historical and current clashes between Democratic mayors and Democratic governors continues. Who's really in control of the party? And you know, now that especially now that Madigan is out of the picture, pretty much, it's kind of interesting to see how mayors and governors of the same party do not get along in this state. It happened with Republicans, and it's happening again with the Democrats.
Sometimes it actually works better when there's a Republican governor, Democratic mayor.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, you know, yeah, Daley worked better with the Republican governor than he did with well, certainly with Walker, which was turned into a real fiasco.
One thing I think we look at where we're going from here. We follow the Burnham plan and look outwards. What about the suburbs? What's happening? I live in Lake County. When I moved here, there weren't very many Democrats, and now there aren't very many Republicans. And this is happening in DuPage County as well, and a little bit in Kane County. And so this is something we should be looking at, how this works out. And it was funny being from the city. And when I moved here, it was the year that Dan Walker got elected governor, and I still couldn't get over that. Because that's where I live. I live in Deerfield.
Well, you got to wear a red bandana and walk around the state, and then you got a shot. See, Dick, if you had tried that, you might have ended up being governor.
Yeah, well, I lost twice for Congress, so of course I ran against Dan Roszkowski, which was a chore.
Yeah.
Well, Betty, when you talk about the suburbs too, and that topic of the flight of Chicago residents, out of state, out of the city, and how that continues and the effect of that as well.
Well, it is going to, we have to see how this is working. The city did not shrink again in the last census. Am I right? I think it still gained a few more people, but it's of course not going to be growing as much as it grew in the 19th century. But the suburbs, some of them aren't growing anymore. So we have to look and see how all this is going to working itself out.
And one of the problems is that we not only don't have regional government, we don't have regional governance. We have some CMAP and other groups try and pull together and make plans, but drawing plans, on a sheet of paper or on the TV, on the computer screen is not the same as getting it done. CMAP does not have the money, and it does not have the authority to tell Naperville that they have to have affordable housing, for instance, to just give one example, but there are many. We're still trying to tell the transportation system may change, where the RTA takes over the 3 transportation systems. We even still have in Cook County 4 mosquito abatement districts. I always thought anybody could throw DDT in the water. I didn't think it was a special skill, but apparently it takes 4 different governments to cover just a small part of Cook County. We have 540 governments in Cook County alone, more than 1,200 in the metropolitan region. And the only way to solve this is to get more state involvement. The state has to provide a metropolitan governance structure, a way to govern better for the metropolitan region.
It's what there's this wonderful Yiddish word that covers these kinds of things called mishigas. It's a
It's a prime example.
Yeah.
We do have a question posed in the Q&A. What impact could the presidential election have on the city if it goes to Trump? Has Biden taken an interest in investing in Chicago?
Yeah, it's an absolute night and day situation. Trump cut the money to the cities. Biden, with both the COVID money and the new infrastructure money that we've gotten in the post-COVID period, Biden's administration, like Barack Obama's, has been favorable to the cities. Trump doesn't like the cities. He thinks he can solve all the crime problems by himself, so why give us any money to do that?
I think, it's the difference between Republican and Democratic administrations is the difference between being able to do some programs and not do some programs. I mean, one of the things that the Kennedy, the Dalys benefited from was, positive relationships. The old man with JFK and Lyndon Johnson, Rich Daley with the Clintons and so forth, and Obama, of course. When it goes the other way, well, you get people that blame Chicago for everything. Chicago is basically a hellhole. Chicago is the worst public school system in the world. Chicago is a place that is run by idiots, and this is all politics, really. It has nothing to do with reality.
Any other questions?
Any other questions come in?
No,
Well, I guess we solved them all.
I could suggest to those that are the libraries that they might want to take a look at our book as a starter for discussion, because normally if you get a room full of people, they will argue about which is the better mayor, or what was the good and the bad of the mayor. So this is a way to start the discussion, even if you're not selling millions of copies of our book. Using it as a template to start the discussion of each of the mayors, I think would be useful for the libraries.
no, I appreciate you saying that, Dick, and also how their mayoral time and term was reflected of the times that they were living in and served too, and the people. But no, I really appreciate all those who tuned in for our conversation. Again, we'll be posting it on our website as well. We did have one more question sneak in.
Oh, okay.
And it said the old machine relied on city workers who would be rewarded for bringing out the vote on elections. Can you
Yes.
comment further on the suggestion made earlier that the CTU has become the new machine, and how will that play out, especially with the inherent conflict of interest as CPS employees who can dictate public policy and financing?
Wow. Okay, Dick, you're
And
on.
a quick word, huh?
We have
So-
3 minutes left, so go for it.
Just as bad as the city council when they cut off my mic if I went too long. The short answer is yes. There is a tension between the CTU and the elections that are coming up for the new school board, which will be an elected school board. There's a tension between the negotiations and what Brandon Johnson's role will be in the negotiations. But there's a big difference between a patronage worker who literally did their work in the precinct for a week or two in the place of doing their work as a government employee. When we looked at the waste under the patronage system, we found objectively that most services in Chicago cost 50 to 150% more than comparable cities like New York or like Milwaukee, even if you adjusted it for population size. So just the sheer waste of the patronage system was an enormous drain on the city of Chicago, and the corrupting influence of whether you were serving your master at City Hall and the people, or you were serving the master as the political boss, is a very different situation.
Anyone else on that?
I'm a retired teacher. Not union, I taught in a Catholic school, but the thing is that when you think of teachers, you don't think of somebody that shirks on a job. And I think we all know what Dick was talking about when you had people that had patronage jobs that may not have even known how to do them, and yet they were being paid regularly. This is not the case with teachers. And so I wouldn't compare them that way.
Well, we're just at 7. If there aren't any more questions, again, thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to the panelists. We'll look forward to posting this. We'll be sharing it with all the recording with all that registered for the program tonight. And again, we'll look forward to seeing what's next for our great city.